All right. Hi, my name is Leah Johnson. I'm a junior here at MSU studying psychology and political science. I'm from Kenai, Alaska, and I'm a TA for this class. So Professor Gersonic gives TAs an opportunity to help with a lecture if they want to at some point. And so when I was thinking about it, I was thinking back on when I took this class and what were some of the things that really stood out to me. And I think similar to maybe a lot of you, what really makes studying abnormal psychology in this class stand out to me is the personal examples that go in with different illnesses when there's a real life story to kind of tie it to it and make it more tangible. And so I was thinking, what personal experiences and connections do I have to the different disorders that we cover? And one of the most prominent is my uncle Timothy. We just called him Tim now. But so today I wanted to do kind of like a case study, like you do with the case study papers, where we'll start by just kind of reviewing a couple of the DSM-5 criteria, and then I'm going to kind of walk through the onset and progression of my Uncle Tim's disease, and you can just kind of keep the things that you're learning in mind about the criteria and symptoms and presentation and different models of treatment, and just kind of flag in your notes or just make a mental note about what you kind of notice with that. This doesn't want to go. Oh, there we go. Okay, so DSM-5 symptoms, you'll have 2 or more of the following for at least 1 month. And so positive symptoms, or again, anything that's added that was not previously there. So that can be delusions, which is a belief that is clearly false or indicates an abnormality in the affected person's content of thought. So has anybody in here seen Princess Diaries? Okay, if I thought I was the Queen of Genovia, that would clearly be a delusion because Genovia is not a real place and I'm very obviously not the Queen of Genovia. A hallucination, a sensory experience that appears real but is created by your mind. So if I looked out at this class and I saw a clown sitting in the very back row, but you all turned around and there was no clown there, then I'm clearly hallucinating. Disorganized speech doesn't really have a clear beginning, middle, end, or point to it, lots of repetition. And then grossly disorganized or catatonic behavior. This can be grossly disorganized would basically just be anything that's kind of odd to onlookers or very socially out of context, like showing up to class in a bikini, something like that. Catatonic behaviors can be kind of a lack of movement or communication, but the positive side of it is that they can also include added agitation, confusion, restlessness. And then we get negative symptoms, which are just kind of a lack of something that was previously there. So affective flattening, reduced or absent expression of affect. You can have just vacant expression, lack of body language, that kind of stuff. Poverty speech, I feel that's pretty self-explanatory. If you're just not really communicating at a level that you used to, goes beyond being shy or quiet. Avolition is more just a lack of motivation. So in addition to this, there'll usually be major impairments to one or more of these areas of life. So work, inability to hold a job or do your kind of normal daily tasks, interpersonal relationships with family members, friends, romantic relationships, self-care, just basic things like clipping your nails and brushing your hair, and level of achievement just at your baseline has a clear decline. And then the duration is that these symptoms will persist for at least 6 months, and that means at least 1 or 2 months with an addition of positive symptoms. But in that time period, there can be, a month or so where there's just negative symptoms. But there does need to be at least 2 or more months of positive symptoms. So that's just kind of a general review of the criteria to kind of keep in mind. So as I transition to telling you a little bit more about my uncle, just kind of keep this in mind. So my uncle is Timothy Lear Johnson. My dad is the oldest of three siblings, and Tim was his younger brother by 2 years. So the two of them were really close, did absolutely everything together. Tim was born on Earth Day, which I mentioned because it's just kind of symbolic for who he was. He was a very, very kind person. He cared a lot about animals and other people. He was like very convicted about eating animals in high school, and so he became a vegetarian and he stuck with that the rest of his life. And that's just kind of the type of person he was. And according to my dad, there was really like nothing different between the two of them. Like looking back at childhood, they can't think of anything that was really, really out of the ordinary with Tim. He was a little bit more introverted, maybe, but nothing indicative of a mental illness. And more than that, he intellectually had no impairments whatsoever. He graduated with honors from his high school, and he went on to the University of Alaska Fairbanks in 1986, where he was studying electrical engineering. And after the end of his freshman year, everything seemed perfectly fine. In fact, it wasn't until 1989 that things started to change. And so my Uncle Tim was really big into the arts. He really loved the arts, and he heard about this guy, Paolo Soleri, who was huge in the 80s. He was an Italian architect. He created this idea he called arcology, which is like a combination of architecture and ecology. And this picture down here is what he envisioned for society. It's called arcosanti, and it's this kind of idea of like a highly dense, populated way of living to maximize the amount of like environment that's untouched. Would not be a good idea for COVID, but Tim was very moved by this guy's idea for the environment and people and sustainability. So he went down to Arizona where they were doing construction on this place in 1989 and started helping out. And we don't really know what happened during that like fall semester period where he was there helping out with this. But it was very clear when he came back that something was different. And just kind of odd things started to show up. And it became clear that Tim was struggling to live on his own. And so my dad invited him to move in with him in his apartment. So things hadn't been getting better once Tim moved in. This was really where they've recognized something was off before, but at this point, things just became really obvious. Tim was doing things like he was staying up all night and he was walking laps around the house just listening to his headphones. He couldn't really sleep, and then when he could sleep, he was screaming each night in his sleep just from night terrors and voices. And one of the kind of like heights of this was when they went to my grandpa Gene's house, and this was the 80s, so it was back in like when MTV was actual like MTV with videos on. And so they were watching the television set, and Tim like looked at them like dead in the eyes, and he's like, I can change the colors of this TV with my mind. And so it was very clear that hallucinations and delusions had kind of taken hold of him. And so they decided to take him to Providence Hospital in the spring of 1990 to kind of interview with a psychiatrist and just see what was going on and if they could find anything to help with him. Just a fun fact, the picture of the moose and the babies to kind of distract from such a heavy topic. And in Alaska, that is like how you know that it's spring, is there will always be like moose with like 2 twin babies. We have moose like you have deer here. So anyways, when they're back at Providence Hospital, it was a clear, quick diagnosis of schizophrenia. And at this point, my dad was kind of the intermediary between Tim and their parents with discussing different treatment options. And he was really, really reluctant to think about psychiatric drugs. He had this kind of new age philosophy, as he described it, just because he was a clear product of the 70s, where he just kind of thought that previously that mental problems were not a real like biological issue, that they were a societal issue. It was a result of society not accepting different ideas and opinions, and they just try to medicate people in order to get them to conform. But after Tim had lived with him for a while and he saw that what Tim was going through, how it was impairing him and the ways that these delusions were causing him pain, he had a change of heart and he decided to start pushing for trying out psychiatric drugs. And shortly after that, Tim began taking some medications and he moved to Polson, Montana with our Grandma Kay. Is anyone here by chance from Polson, Flathead Lake area? All right, beautiful area, highly recommend. So when Tim got to Polson, throughout that summer, it was clear that the medication was not making him stable. He just continued to have a lot of significant changes to his personality to where you really couldn't recognize that Tim was Tim. He had lost his sense of humor. Him and my grandpa had gone to a theater production together, and my grandpa says they were just, it was hilarious, and he was laughing the whole time. But Tim just sat there completely like stone-faced the entire production. And at the end of it, he turned to him and he's like, Tim, did you find that funny at all? And he was just, no, absolutely not. So he had this clear kind of affective flattening. His concentration was diminished a lot, which really could have resulted from disorganized thinking. He got really sleepy all the time. And it's highly likely that the drugs that he was taking were really sedative. And the voices at night made sleeping really hard. And there's just a lot there to kind of mess with that. He described that he could see lights, kind of similar to the MTV thing. And as far as voices, he really didn't talk about it a lot with many people. But when he would kind of open up and share with what he was hearing and what was being said to him, he said it was incredibly negative. Things like, get a job, you're doing terrible, just horrible kind of banter in the back of his mind. And at the height of this time period, the circumstances around the event are a little bit fuzzy. I don't know exactly what happened, but I know it was some sort of like an innocent initial encounter, but he was confronted by a police officer for something, and this kind of delusional persecutory thoughts and agitation invaded, and the police was unable to de-escalate the situation. One thing led to another, and we know that he punched a police officer and ended up getting arrested. This happened in 1990, so way before I was born. But when I was told about it later on, and thinking about the Tim that I know, I could not believe it. Like, really nothing could have been more indicative that there was something seriously wrong going on, because that is just completely unlike him. And it's very fortunate that in some ways that Tim had a family who was there when that happened, and our family went to the police station and bailed him out and advocated for him and made sure that was a one-time offense. But many people do not have that, and that's something that's discussed in this class a lot, the incarceration of mentally ill individuals, because there's no way to know, but had Tim not had our family, there is always the possibility that he could have gotten into the system and he could have just gotten stuck there. He never could have gotten the treatment and the care that he needed. and just been in a kind of perpetual cycle. Yes?
I had a question for you. When you got back from, I forget where it was there any sort of like drug use or stressful event you guys were aware of? And then second, how long did it take for the family to realize that he needed treatment and get him treatment?
Yeah, so that's actually, it's speculated that there was drug use while he was gone, but it's unclear really what it was or if it was something that kind of triggered an onset of his disorder or if it was like a way to cope with the disorder and like the symptoms he was already experiencing. He was a very private person, so this wasn't anything he really like wanted to share with people. And as far as long as it took, I think it took, he came back in around December and it was around like February that he went to go to the Providence Center, so around like a month or two. So the different kinds of treatment, as the disease continued to progress, it was clear that the kind of medication alone wasn't going to be enough. They tried lots of different kinds of medication at different dosages, and it wasn't producing necessarily the results they were hoping for. He spent some time at the River Center in Missoula, mostly as an outpatient to the day center, doing group therapy with kind of CBT, DBT. So thinking about like case studies, it's more of a kind of coordinated care effort with biological model and cognitive behavioral therapy. He also had periodic appointments with a psychiatrist to evaluate whether or not the drugs are working. But when I talked to my grandpa about this, just kind of reviewing a lot of this before I presented, he said that he was pretty unhappy with the appointments with the psychiatrist, that it was very overbooked, they were brief, they just kind of like gave him like a couple minutes to give a complete overview of everything that he was doing and like whether or not it was working. So that's just something to keep in mind with that. I don't know if that impacted the way how effective or not the drugs were, but he felt as though the psychiatrist wasn't getting an accurate representation of where Tim was at. So over time, this was really a 2-decade period from the onset in his 20s to his 40s, that he was really struggling. But through trying different medications, and the center I think is really what's been emphasized as helping a ton, in like helping him learn to manage his medications, and because they would watch like when he's taking what and help him with that, and they give him different strategies for coping. And eventually, like, you really can't know in retrospect whether the voices and the persecutory delusions and things like that were decreasing, but his affect had improved so much that we kind of logically think that had improved in that way. So when we think back to the DSM-5, like where you have significant impairments in social work, interpersonal relationships, things like that, Tim had started to see dramatic increases towards the end of his life. He was finally able to get his own apartment, and he started reading books again. He really loved to read, and he had just shelves full of like physics books that he would highlight and take notes in and ask questions about. And my dad talked about going back down there, visiting him in Missoula, and they sat up and watched a horror movie all night. And that was something they used to love doing when they were kids, but they weren't able to do while Tim was really ill because it was just too much for him. So by all means, he seemed to be progressing and returning to himself. But tragically, one night in his sleep, he got a blood clot in his leg, which traveled up his body and caused him to pass away pretty suddenly. It was very unexpected. Nobody saw that coming, but in hindsight, he had put on a lot of weight since his disorder began. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. Part of it, I think, is the medication, because they did make him really tired. It was hard to find the motivation to get up and to do things and exercise. And it's likely that focusing so much on his mental health led to the kind of sidelining of his physical health. Um, Additionally, in some medications, there's like a 32% increased risk that you can develop blood clots. It's not ridiculously high, but that is definitely something to keep in mind. So in sharing with you about my Uncle Tim's life, really just why I wanted to do this and what I hope that you get from this are a couple different things. First of all, Tim was a really kind person who was struck with a tragic illness. During those 2 decades, Tim was unrecognizable. When your mind is impaired, it's just, who are you? But there were moments where you could see glimpses of Tim, but it was really towards the end of his life that he started to become himself again. That in mind, we really want this to be a story of hope, that even though Tim's story didn't end obviously the way anyone would want, he really saw a progression upwards, and change is possible. Just thinking of a man who stayed up all night screaming because of the delusions in his mind, coming to a point where he can get an apartment of his own. And his social worker came to the funeral, and she told our family that at the River Center there was like a woman that Tim had been talking to, and she thinks they would have like ended up going on a date sometime soon. And I mean that's huge. So significant increase in work and interpersonal relationships, things like that. Then the next thing is it's really important to treat individuals with mental illnesses with tolerance. It's really, really hard to imagine what it would be like to experience day-to-day life with these voices in the back of your head. I find it hard enough to stand in front of all of you and concentrate on this, but if I had a voice telling me that, you're doing terrible, like you're stuttering, something like that, I would find it incredibly difficult to just get through a sentence, much less this whole presentation. And then lastly, just how important it is to destigmatize mental health, because it's really rare to find a family who does not have somebody close to them who has a mental illness, and there's just no need for it to be such a big kind of scary thing. So talking about returning to number 3 with treating people with tolerance, there's a really great video that I wanted us to watch really quick. Just kind of, they call it an exercise in empathy, or just kind of like what it might be like to experience this like voices in your head on a day-to-day basis.
I'm going to put these earphones in and then I'm trying to do a series of tests. Okay, so I'm now hearing the whispers and voices in my head, and the first test is some number puzzles.
You suck and they know it. Can't you get this right?
Okay, so I did this test for 3 minutes and I did not get a single one. It's very hard to concentrate when, if it's like music or something constant, it's easy, but people talking to you is very difficult. So now I'm going to be asked a series of questions by our producer, Susan, and these are basically a series of questions that a person would be asked if they were being admitted to a hospital.
Can you tell me what day it is?
Yeah, it's Sunday, June, I don't know, what's the date, 7th?
So I'm going to say 5 numbers, and I want you to repeat them back to me after I'm done.
Okay.
5, 23, 67, 2, 76.
5, 23, 67, something 76.
I'm going to say 5 words. You don't have to repeat them, but just listen to them. Cat, book, cigar, damage, and rain. Can you name the last 4 presidents of the United States?
Barack Obama, George Bush,
Right.
Bill Clinton, and George Bush.
So those 5 words I said before, can you remember any of them?
No. It's hard because sometimes voices are like whispering, and sometimes they're aggressive, and sometimes they're kind of comforting. But again, when people kind of talking to you all the time,
It's okay.
it's hard.
Don't worry. Now or later.
So I'm going to try to make a boat origami following these instructions.
It'll be okay.
Shut up!
I wanted to talk back to the voices now, but it's really distracting.
Do not touch that stuff. You suck. What are you looking at? It's easy. You want to touch that?
I can do this.
Hand down. Keep your eyes down. Just do it. Filthy mind. Leave it alone.
It's also frustrating because they're just telling me I can't do it, and so I didn't do a very good job with the boat. But it's really hard to focus when people are whispering to you and talking to you.
Just come clear. Come near to me. Come near for help.
Hey, do you have yesterday's paper? Yesterday's New York Times? No? Okay, let's get started. It's incredibly distracting on the street to have somebody talking in your head, and it makes you feel completely isolated from everyone else around you. You don't want to engage in conversation with other people. You kind of find yourself wanting to engage in conversation with the voice in your head. They're constantly being really negative and talking to you, and everything they're saying relates to things that you're actually doing. They're criticizing things you're doing. It's like it's like you have a chorus watching you and commenting on what you're doing, and you can't help it. I mean, I literally find myself wanting to kind of respond to them, kind of tell them to be quiet, and it's incredibly unpleasant. This is a very, very unpleasant experiment. It's really it's eye-opening because it kind of really shows you what other people must be going through who deal with this on a regular basis. But also, like, I cannot wait to take these headphones off because it's really depressing. It's very negative. It makes you feel very, very negative. Yeah, it's very creepy. I want it to stop.
Eyes down. Back up. Stand up now. I'll count you off. I'll count 20, 30, 40. Stand up now. Walk away.
You're okay.
Walk now.
Pacify. On to pacify. All the way to make it home.
For Opie.
Yeah, so it's hard to imagine going through daily life with something like that. Yeah, so thank you so much for listening to this presentation. I hope that hearing about my uncle's story was impactful to you in some way or another. Is there any questions? Yeah?
First of all, thanks so much for speaking. It wasn't easy to talk about family member. I was wondering, like near the beginning, when you talked about his onset, you said that he wasn't able to sleep and that he would like hear voices at night. Do you know how aware he was of his state of mind? Like, did he seem really stressed about it or fearful? I don't know. How did he feel throughout that? And then later as well, as he got better, do you know if he knew that there was something seriously wrong with him?
Yeah, I know that when he was really sick and when it was really hard, this was reality to him. My dad told me about this like philosophy that he devised that he called like the system, and it was like he filled like hundreds and hundreds of pages of spiral notebooks just with this like philosophy for how to live life, and if you make one mistake it throws off the entire system. And to him that was very real and tangible. um, as far as I know it was like that throughout most of the disease, but I do believe towards the end of his life, when things started to get better, that there was kind of I think part of that was realizing that there's a difference between reality and what he was experiencing and learning how to manage that.
Was he able to maintain a job throughout his life?
No, he was not. Yeah, I guess when I talked back to my family members, interviewing different people while I was putting this presentation together, there was kind of a consensus that they had hoped that he would be able to go back to school pretty soon, before he had passed away. 'Cause he had started picking up books about things that he was really passionate about, and he seemed to be able to. His concentration wasn't like honed in enough to where he could go back and do classes yet, but they were hopeful that he would have been able to soon. Yeah, in asking my family, none of them have any real like expertise in psychology, and so
It was, I was thinking that too. I think it's right around that time frame, kind of mid to late 80s, when they started to switch over from things like Haldol and stuff, which is first generation, to some of the newer antipsychotics that we have now.
I'm just curious if maybe he was able to get access to those at a later time, and maybe that was helpful as well in his treatment. Yeah, I mean, yeah, most likely. I don't know too much about the specifics of the drugs that he took, but that makes sense.
That says the 1980s. Second generation.
Is there any more questions? All right, well, thank you so much for listening. Do you want me to leave this up here?
I'll use it. Yep. Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Leah. I just want to thank Leah in front of everybody. That was really good. Thank you very much. And I think you did a great job honoring his life, and also sharing the struggles that he went through, and raising our awareness about this disease. And what struck me the most was how you made somebody with a major mental illness have be seen as a person, and a person that somebody and people cared for and loved. And I think that's really important for us all to recognize, is that when we see people and they're talking to themselves, or they're having